On May 13, 1939, the MS St. Louis sailed from Hamburg, Germany. The ship sailed year-round on the North Atlantic route from Hamburg to New York. This time, however, the ship was bound for Havana, the capital and largest city of the Republic of Cuba. The ship carried 937 passengers. Most of them were Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. The fleeing passengers called it a vacation cruise to freedom. Today, history records the journey as the Voyage of the Damned. Please follow me and subscribe to my channel. We start today with a discussion on the hugely controversial issue of immigration. We will first reflect on real events throughout history. Arnold said, "If we cannot learn from history, history will teach us a lesson again and again." Gustav Schröder, fluent in 7 languages, became captain of the MS Oziana in August 1936, and he soon assumed command of the MS St. Louis. Despite violating Nazi regulations, Captain Schröder continued to allow Jews to perform religious services during the voyage. He even provided passengers with food that was rationed in Germany. Childcare is provided while parents dine. Cruise ships also held dances and concerts for guests. Children splashed around in the pool, and the crews offered swimming lessons. Hitler's bust was purposely covered with a tablecloth. The Atlantic voyage went very smoothly, and on the summer waves, everything was like a vacation in the Garden of God. The 2-week vacation soon came to an end. At 4 o'clock on May 27, the MS St. Louis anchored in the port of Havana, but she was denied access to her usual docking area. The Cuban authorities refused to allow the passengers to land, even though they had legal tourist visas to Cuba. Unbeknownst to the Jewish refugees in St. Louis, they had fallen victim to the political struggle in Cuba. Cuba was economically depressed at the time. For politicians, blaming immigrants for everything is a good excuse to avoid culpability. The general public, who have no common sense of economics, does not realize that immigrants will bring more business opportunities and more technological innovations, including the combined effect, which results in creating more jobs for the native population. Manipulated by politicians, they blame unemployment on the false fact that immigrants are taking their jobs, not realizing that the deterioration of the economy is the result of politicians' self-righteous intervention in the market. The folly of history is like influenza, taking its turn every time the economy goes into the winter. The news of the MS St. Louis setting sail triggered a massive anti-Semitic march in Havana. To prevent the possible entry of immigrants into Cuba, as recently as May 5, President Federico Laredo Bruce signed Decree 937, which restricted entry of all foreigners except U.S. citizens, unless authorized by Cuban secretaries of state, and subject to a bond of U.S. $500. No one aboard the MS St. Louis knew about this new bill beforehand. The Jews are ancestral to the Hebrews and belong to the Semites. Rather than relying on blood ties, though, it would be more accurate to put that the Jewish people are a people formed on religion and culture. This makes this nation, which once spanned millennia without a state, extraordinarily cohesive. On May 28, Lawrence Berenson, an attorney appointed by the U.S.-based Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, arrived in Cuba to negotiate with the Cuban government on behalf of the MS St. Louis passengers. Berenson, a former president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Cuba, has extensive business experience in Cuba. He met with President Federico Bru, but was unable to convince him to allow the passengers to enter Cuba. And on June 2, Federico Bru ordered the ship to leave Cuban waters. Desperate Jewish refugees on the ship nearly rioted, with many threatening to commit suicide. The Cuban government set up a cordon to prevent the refugees from jumping overboard and swimming ashore. Searchlights were also used for surveillance at night. One desperate passenger committed suicide and was allowed to be hospitalized in Havana. 22 other Jews with U.S. visas, 4 Spanish citizens, and 2 Cuban nationals were allowed to land. 5 days later, the MS St. Louis was ordered to sail away from Cuba. Captain Gustav Schröder knew what awaited her passengers if the ship returned to Germany. He urgently requested asylum from other countries on the American continent. At the same time, Schröder commanded the cruise ship to sail to Miami, USA. After Cuba denied entry to the passengers on the MS St. Louis, millions of readers around the world learned of the incident through the press, including in the United States. Although American newspapers generally portrayed the plight of the passengers with great sympathy, the conservative United States took a rejectionist stance, except for a few journalists and editors who suggested that the refugees should be allowed to enter the United States. Passengers aboard the MS St. Louis saw the lights of Miami and called President Franklin Delano Roosevelt for asylum. Roosevelt did not respond, although at one point the president was prepared to allow a few to go ashore. He was prevented from doing so by Secretary of State Cordell, who later instructed the State Department not to take extraordinary measures to allow refugees to enter the United States. As the longest-serving Secretary of State in U.S. history, Cordell, for an 11-year term, also refused to help the Jewish refugees on the SS Kwanzaa in Portugal. It was not until First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt intervened directly that the Jewish refugees on the SS Kwanzaa landed on September 11, 1940, in Virginia. In a similar incident, an attempt by American Jews to raise funds to prevent the mass murder of Romanian Jews was obstructed by the State Department. In wartime, in order to send money out of the United States, 2 government agencies had to sign a simple release: the Treasury Department under Henry Morgenthau and the State Department under Secretary Cordell. Morgenthau signed immediately. The State Department delayed, and delayed, as more Jews were dying in the Transnistria camps. Henry Morgenthau, Jr. played a central role in helping the United States enter World War II, particularly with the Lend-Lease Act, support for European and Chinese resistance, help for Jewish refugees, and the Morgenthau Plan to eliminate the German military industry. In contrast, when the French Liberation Army, under Charles-André Joseph Marie de Gaulle, occupied the Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, south of Newfoundland, in December 1941, Cordell protested very strongly, even going so far as to refer to de Gaulle's French Liberation Navy as the so-called Free French. Hall also demanded the reinstatement of the Governor-General of Vichy France, which was strongly criticized by the American press, and teased him as the so-called Secretary of State. Negotiations between Lawrence Berenson and Cuba are still continuing. Cuban President Federico Bru offered to let the passengers in if the U.S.-based Jewish Joint Distribution Committee paid a bond of $453,500, $500 per passenger. Berenson made a counteroffer, but Bru rejected the offer and broke off the negotiations. A group of Canadian scholars and clergymen also acted to persuade Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King to grant asylum to the passengers. Frederick Charles Blair, the head of Canada's Immigration Department, was hostile to Jewish immigrants and, on June 9, persuaded the head of government not to intervene. Had been rejected by the U.S. Captain Gustav Schröder was at one point prepared to run the MS St. Louis aground on a coast to force the U.S. government to accept the refugees. But on Hall's instructions, a U.S. Coast Guard vessel kept the MS St. Louis under surveillance and prevented her from doing so. Throughout history, the lighthouses of civilization have always been lit first in Europe. That was true in the past, and that is true in the present. But what about the future? On June 6, 1939, the MS St. Louis was forced to begin a return voyage to Hamburg, Germany. On the voyage return to Europe, an atmosphere of despair permeated the ship. with some people choosing to commit suicide by jumping overboard. To protect his passengers, Captain Schröder decided to sink the Ms. St. Louis off the coast of England, forcing the British government to effect a rescue. Thanks to press reports and multiple efforts, notably those of Morris Carlton Troper of the US-based Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and German-born Jewish-American banker Paul Berwald, after many negotiations with European governments, British Prime Minister Arthur Neville Chamberlain allowed the Ms. St. Louis to call at the British port of Southampton on June 10. In the end, the UK received 288, 32% passengers, France 224, 25%, Belgium 240, only 3.59%, and the Netherlands 181, 20%. The ship returned to Hamburg without any passengers. The following year, following the Battle of France and the Nazi occupation of Belgium, France, and the Netherlands in May 1940, all Jews in these countries were at high risk, including the Jewish refugees they received.
Of the 620 St. Louis passengers who returned to continental Europe, we determined that 87 were able to emigrate before Germany invaded Western Europe on May 10, 1940. 254 passengers in Belgium, France, and the Netherlands after that date died during the Holocaust. Most of these people were murdered in the killing centers of Auschwitz and Sobibor. The rest died in internment camps, in hiding or attempting to evade the Nazis. 365 of the 620 passengers who returned to continental Europe survived the war. Of the 288 passengers sent to Britain, the vast majority were alive at war's end.
From 1940 to 1944, the Ms. St. Louis was requisitioned by the German Navy. During the Allied bombing of the Kiel barracks on August 30, 1944, the ship was severely damaged, then repaired, and in 1946, used as a water hotel in Hamburg. It was finally completely dismantled in 1952. After the war, the captain Gustav Schröder was awarded the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany by the West German government, and in 1993, he was posthumously recognized by Israel as a righteous among the nations.
It was tragedies like that of the Ms. St. Louis that prompted the international community to create the 1951 Refugee Convention, defining the rights of refugees and the duty to protect them. Americans have welcomed almost 3 million refugees from every region of the world into our community since 1980. In fact, more than half of all refugees resettled to third countries now come to America, more than all other resettlement countries combined. A photo of the Ms. St. Louis hangs in the front office of the State Department's Refugee Bureau as a powerful reminder and source of motivation. Our actions since the St. Louis, we hope, speak more eloquently than any words could to our dedication and commitment to shelter and to protect. The hard lessons of the Ms. St. Louis are with us always. They are with us in the heavy and humbling knowledge that we are the most powerful nation in a still dangerous world, that our role comes with special responsibilities, that anti-Semitism, genocide, and mass displacement are, sadly, all too alive in 2012, that there are other Ms. St. Louises setting sail right now, that there is always more we can and must do.